So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker. I can say with confidence that I am his biggest fan. He enjoys long walks on the beach and fishing. So my job now is to take you from a very interesting set of scientific presentations that give you an idea of the scope and breadth of synthetic biology projects and to bore you with a discussion of international bureaucracy. So I have in the schedule 15 minutes to give this presentation. I'm counting on Sonia to give me the 5-minute flag, and if I exceed my time, I am fully prepared to have a horde of people from the lightning round come and drag me off the stage. So I will try to stick within my time. If I can get the slides up on the screen. I'll start by just offering a personal reflection. I first heard about synthetic biology at a conference in 2005, and at the time I was fresh from my own research as a developmental biologist. And it seemed unbelievable to me that people would even think that they could accomplish something so ambitious as to take huge numbers of genes and develop biological tools. Biological systems are messy and they're complicated, and none of them ever cooperated with me, so I couldn't understand why anybody would think they would cooperate with anybody else. But when I was a kid, you could say the same thing about computers. If you wanted to build a computer in the 1980s, you were soldering transistors, not transcriptors, but transistors onto a particle board. And flash forward 40 years, and a couple of years ago, I built a computer myself for fun as a hobby. And it involved going to the store, buying a bunch of parts off the shelf, and putting the thing together. And I know nothing about computers, but I'll be darned if it doesn't work. And so my ability to do that is dependent on a huge volume of research and discovery from materials engineers, computer scientists, electrical engineers, none of which I could tell you anything about. But it's been a huge research enterprise, and it's led to good things. Every single person in this room has a computer in their pocket more powerful than people could have dreamt of in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I think as we hear about the kind of research that's being done and the scope of activities that are being ascribed to synthetic biology, I think we can see that probably not tomorrow and maybe not next year, but we're heading to a future where this kind of off-the-shelf biological tool becomes a reality. So it hasn't escaped the notice of international forums that synthetic biology is becoming a real and tangible subject. And I'm going to talk to you about some efforts that are ongoing in international forums to address synthetic biology, particularly looking at biosafety, which is, after all, the subject of our conference. I'll start with a very quick overview of why international forums matter, although I suspect people already know this, and then which ones are working on the topic. Two come to mind. One is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which has already been mentioned earlier in the conference, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has also been mentioned. And then I'll talk about what specifically they're doing, and then I'll wax philosophical about what I think we can learn from that experience so far. So why do international forums matter? Well, I think increasingly international agreements are taking on greater importance in our global economy, certainly for our global research enterprise, and for agricultural biotechnology, for certain international forums matter a lot. Compliance in those forums is often required to facilitate trade, and developments in those forums can have a material impact on both research and product development. Certainly it's true that developing and newly developed countries often place a high weight on what happens in international forums, and they're aggressive in adopting provisions directly into domestic law and regulation. And I think if you think back to the first day of our conference, you can see this in the countries' reports on how they've adopted the provisions under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Cartagena Protocol into their domestic regulations. And of course, developments in international organizations are often related to funding for development of activities, including capacity building, as well as development for regulation. It's also true that some international forums, particularly the Convention on Biological Diversity, frequently consider the generation of restrictions, and whether those restrictions are a good idea or not is immaterial. They certainly have an impact on future developments in scientific research and development. And I think it's important that both the research and the regulatory community understand what those discussions are and how they're developing. So again, what international forums are interested in synthetic biology? The primary two are the OECD and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in fact, the OECD is doing very little on synthetic biology. So this is the last slide where I'll talk about their efforts. But I think it's important because the way they're considering synthetic biology is very different than the Convention on Biological Diversity. So primarily within the OECD, the Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate is looking at synthetic biology and how it's developing in the research field. And they've produced a report. It is a publicly available report. You have to pay for it, as is not uncommon with OECD publications. But the focus of the report is on developments in the field for research. And one of the principal conclusions is that there's been a lack of commercial products being introduced coming out of synthetic biology efforts. And so OECD is really focused on trying to identify the causal factors for that to see if they can stimulate more development in this area because of their mission of economic development. It's also worth noting that they have identified some problematic issues with the term synthetic biology, and their preferred phrase within the OECD is now engineering biology. So if you hear engineering biology, you might make note of the fact that it encompasses synthetic biology, particularly coming out of the OECD. The Convention on Biological Diversity has a very different mission than the OECD, and they're looking at it at synthetic biology in a very different way. So I'm going to describe a series of decisions that have been taken at the meeting of the parties, lovingly referred to as the MOP, or the Convention of Parties, the COP. And they've put together an ad hoc technical experts group, which is referred to as an ATEG, just to bewilder and confuse everybody with our acronyms, as well as a series of online expert forums. I refrained from putting quotes around expert forums, partly because I participate in the expert forums, and it's good for my ego to believe that I'm actually an expert on synthetic biology. So some history and the context for the Convention on Biological Diversity and their work in this area. The convention entered into force in 1993, and it's ratified by 196 countries at the moment. I think there's 197 countries in the world, so I will leave it to your imagination which one has not ratified the CBD, and that's the last I'll talk about it. The purpose of the convention, and this is a paraphrase, but I think it's an accurate one, is the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, as well as the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that are derived from the use of that biodiversity. It's important to note that the CBD is the parent convention for the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which I hope we're all familiar with by now, which deals with the transboundary movement of living modified organisms. This is in here for two reasons. One, to show you that the CBD is involved in a lot of areas, so not just synthetic biology. They're doing lots of things, but also because without this diagram, my presentation is entirely text slides. So just to have mercy on your eyeballs, I threw this in here. It's a timeline of events and activities that have been taken by the convention. I know you can't read them, but at least maybe you can see the colors and note how the number of activities has been expanding over time. So there's actually quite a lot going on under the auspices of the convention right now. Synthetic biology was more or less first introduced at the COP10 in 2010, and lots of discussions took place there, but it was encapsulated in Decision 1013 on new and emerging issues. And so this is a decision that shows up at every COP. They address new and emerging issues, and it deals with a number of things. In this particular decision, the COP also addressed ocean acidification, ocean noise, surface level ozone. So a lot of things are captured in this decision, and synthetic biology is just one of them. And it was a minor part, but an important one. The decision more or less indicated that information on synthetic biology should be submitted by the members, the parties to the convention, to something called the SBSTA, which is the Subsidiary Body on Scientific, Technical, and Technological Advice. So it's a scientific advisory committee to the COP. And the decision, and this is quoted, invites parties, other governments, and relevant organizations to share information while applying a precautionary approach to the field release of synthetic life, cell, or genome into the environment. So this is very typical language for decisions in the convention. They often invoke precaution, and again, the purpose of the convention is conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So I just want to highlight that because I want to make a comparison to what happens at the next COP in 2012. Again, you see decision 1111, just a coincidence. Parties are invited to provide information to the Secretariat. I know this text is small. I'm not going to read it to you because you're all literate, but it just makes more specific an invitation to share information on aspects of synthetic biology, particularly on living organisms that are being derived and what their potential impact is on sustainable use of biological diversity, as well as the associated socioeconomics that are considered under the COP. For this, the Secretariat would compile a report, oh darn, 5 minutes, to consider possible gaps in oversight, and then, to me, importantly, despite no release of synthetic biological organisms in the environment and thus no associated damage, the decision makes an increasingly urgent plea to urge parties, their word, not mine, and the italics are theirs, not mine as well, parties, and invites other governments, other government, singular, to take a precautionary approach in accordance with the convention when addressing threats to biological diversity resulting from synthetic biology. So you can see even from the decisions without witnessing the events that the level of concern around synthetic biology within the forum is rising. So coming out of that COP-MOP, the Secretariat produced 2 reports, one on potential positive and negative impacts of synthetic biology, and then a second report on potential gaps in oversight and regulation vis-a-vis the convention with regard to synthetic biology. So I think if you look at those reports, there's 2 important conclusions. One, and this is a quote, just so you believe me, existing biosafety risk assessment frameworks are likely to be sufficient for synthetic biology. This echoes what John Team presented in our first part of the session this morning. Also, synthetic organisms more or less have the potential to cause harm in the same way as other organisms. So it's not that they may be harmful or may not be harmful, but that the ways that they interact with biodiversity are similar to the way other organisms might. And also those organisms are governed by a variety of international treaties, including the World Trade Organization, as well as the Cartagena Protocol underneath the convention. The topic again appeared at COP 12 and 13. I'm going to condense these a little bit. In light of the reports and the recommendation of the SBC, the parties established an ad hoc technical experts group. So for the purposes of our discussion, this just represents increased attention to synthetic biology within the organization. They also produced a definition of synthetic biology, which is an important effort, but problematic for a number of ways. So synthetic biology under the convention is a further development and new dimension of modern biotechnology that combines science, technology, and engineering to facilitate and accelerate the understanding, design, redesign, manufacture, and/or modification of genetic materials, living organisms, and biological systems. It's actually a pretty good definition if you think about the scope of synthetic biology, but people continue to very seriously debate the accuracy and whether the definition needs to be modified. COP13 met and extended the work of the ATEG as well as a number of other things, including the ultimately unsuccessful, but I think very serious effort by certain participants to impose a moratorium on aspects of synthetic biology, in particular on gene drives. The online forums are ongoing. These are very interesting forums. I think it's a very good use of technology by the Secretariat. There's 4 topics that are supposed to be addressed. The first was to review recent technological developments that could impact biodiversity. That forum is completed. Interestingly, number 3 is also completed to further analyze evidence of benefits, blah, 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 and adverse effects resulting from synthetic biology. This was done in 2 parts, one on benefits and one on adverse effects. At the moment, right as we speak, they're in the middle of the online forum on consideration of whether any organisms produced through synthetic biology would escape the definition of living modified organism under the Cartagena Protocol. I won't leave you in suspense. The consensus on the forum is that no one can think of one that would escape the definition. And then later on this month, there will be an online forum to evaluate the availability of tools to detect and monitor synthetic biology organisms. The ATEG will convene again in December to incorporate both solicited views from parties as well as the results of the online forums and produce a report that will go to the SABC next January. Presumably, the SABC will produce their own report to be delivered to parties at the COP next November. So I just have a couple more slides. I'm probably over time, much to my embarrassment. But why does this matter? So other than to give me something to do up here, why should you care about this? Well, I think it's obvious that the CBD matters. It matters to the governments in South Asia and certainly to governments around the world. And I think it's important to understand that the focus of this organization is on preventing damage, which is a laudable goal and I think one that we all share. So there's an emphasis on precaution, not to release things into the environment that might cause damage. But I think one of the side effects of that focus is that it tends to obscure benefits of technology. And I think we can applaud the efforts of the Secretariat to collect information on benefits of synthetic biology, but if you're witnessing the discussions that are going on in the forum, they're much more preoccupied on the potential future adverse impacts. And I think that's fine. I won't offer much commentary on that. But I do think it's important for scientists who are involved in research and development to understand the conversations that are going on there and make sure that you work with your focal points within your government and for your country to make sure that your views are being accommodated in the forum as well. The importance of allowing you to continue your research and others to continue the research like the efforts that have been presented here today, because these are important efforts not only to advance scientific knowledge, but to address real-world problems that will be important and ultimately will be important for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So I am finished. Thank you very much for your attention.